Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. All American. It's been an exciting week around here at Kleinhans, an American music festival. Earlier this week on Thursday night, we had four very talented composers joining us here with the Philharmonic, and we were reading their scores, their orchestral scores, for the very first time. It was part of our earshot partnership with the American Composers Orchestra based in New York City, and it was actually the second year that we've done this, a very successful program last year, and this year they had a national call, received 198 scores from all around the country, from university students, graduate students, and young professors. The only stipulation being that you had recently written an orchestral score of no more than 10 minutes, and your piece had not been performed by a symphony orchestra yet. And out of the 198, 47 were chosen and shipped to me in the largest FedEx box that I've ever received in my life. I spent about 3 days going through 20 pounds of music. We selected 4 composers to come here, and we had just a thrilling 2 days here of reading their music. They received a professional recording of their work. They had symposiums throughout the day, and it just reminded me and, of course, my colleagues in the orchestra so much about how music is living and breathing, always evolving, and people are always writing new music, just as Beethoven's music was new at one time, Mozart's music as well. Here we had the first actual performances of 4 young composers, and certainly very fitting that it was during this week in my classics program here this weekend being all American music. I love American music because it's our music. Of course, our country is so young, but our music is even younger, and we have an influence all around the world. Of course, you think of jazz music just being such a powerful force in the world, coming from America, for also Broadway and rock and roll. But classical music in this country got off to actually a slow start, because it was only in the late 1800s we had some very talented composers in this country. Of course, our country was still young, but the composers that were writing in a strictly European style. You had composers like Chadwick and MacDowell, who, if you were to listen to their music and not know who you were listening to, you'd be hard-pressed to say whether it was an American composer you were hearing, or if you were listening to a work of an English romantic in the late 1800s. And of course, we know that the first distinctive American voice to emerge on the classical music scene was Charles Ives. But he was writing in relative obscurity throughout the entirety of his career. And if you know anything about Ives, you know that he had to sell insurance to make a living. But he was doing some very radical things out on the East Coast in his writing. Just the complexity of his rhythms, incorporating American folk tunes into his orchestral pieces. His Fourth Symphony, for example, is one of the most difficult pieces still ever to perform. It requires 5 conductors, which is fascinating, isn't it? It all looks like they're just doing Tai Bo or Tai Chi up on stage, and the orchestra somehow manages to find them. But Ives was a real pioneer in music. But of course, since he wasn't widely performed until much later in his life, he didn't have the impact that the next wave of American composers did. And if you were to name off the top of your head who is the most popular, who is the most often performed American composer in the classical music scene, we would probably, most of us, say Aaron Copland. His music is ubiquitous. You hear the fanfare for the common man all the time, not only in the Olympic ceremonies or to start off some very ceremonial events, that the sound of the trumpets with their majestic opening tune and the timpani and bass drum. Also the hoedown, which you will have a performance of tonight, was famous, I think, during the 90s, wasn't it, for the beef commercials? But of course, it was his 3 ballet scores that really set this trend and what is an American sound. But before I talk about the Copland, I want to just mention our works in chronological order. There's another fascinating work on this program that many of you might not be familiar with, and it's Roy Harris's Third Symphony. Because while Copland really is a household name, Roy Harris is not. But Roy Harris wrote the first great American symphony. Other symphonies had been written before, but the first symphony that could really readily be identified as American in sound, in concept, in structure, everything about this piece was startling, was groundbreaking at the time. It's a piece that's not performed quite often anymore. The larger orchestras roll it out about every 10 years to play it because it is an important piece of American musical history, but it's not on programs that often anymore. I think the last performance of it here was in 1999. It's a symphony, but it's a one-movement symphony. It's 18 minutes. Everything is very compact, and there are distinct sections in it which actually give it a sense of being longer than it really is. But what's so interesting about this piece is Roy Harris and his work, because he grew up in the Midwest, Oklahoma, so certainly he had a sense of what prairie life is like. And for any of you who have spent any time driving in the prairies, you know how expansive it can be, 60, 70 miles to the next gas station, nothing but flat open fields all around you. And when we think about the American sound that Copland and Harris helped to develop, that's one of the first things that we think about, this expansive sound, wide open sonorities, just large, very big. And Roy Harris certainly was not the craftsman that many of the other composers that came around him were. William Schumann, Aaron Copland, Walter Piston, Sessions. Many of these composers had a sheer grasp of the technicalities of composition. They were able to write for the orchestra in a very polished way. They were able to develop their musical material in a way that was very structured and very sound. But Roy Harris was very raw. He had great ideas. He put it down on paper very well. The melodies are very beautiful, but something about the way that things develop in Roy Harris's music just don't have quite the masterful touch that some of the other American composers do. But that's no discredit to him, because what you get in this third symphony is something distinctly American. I want to mention, before I talk about the piece itself, a quote that Aaron Copland, who could be a little acerbic and a little snarky, frankly, wrote later in his life. He was talking about all of his colleagues, which usually isn't a good thing to do when you're a little bit angry, but he didn't really have a lot of great things to say about most of his colleagues. All of these guys, household names, Samuel Barber as well as Walter Piston, but he mentioned with Roy Harris, his great weakness was that he seldom seemed his great weakness was that he seldom was able to shape a piece so that it made sense from beginning to end and seemed logical and inevitable, though the Third Symphony remained a terrific piece, in some ways the most impressive symphony ever produced in America, this despite having an unfortunately conventional ending. So those are pretty strong words from Copland. Of course, he's critical, like he was of all of his colleagues, but he did say that it might be the greatest American symphony ever. And when you think of the great American symphonies, there are usually the three that are considered the great three. Harris's third, Aaron Copland's Third Symphony, and William Schumann's Third Symphony are usually considered the triptych of American symphonies. But this work begins so beautifully. I can't think of another symphony that begins this way. It's really a hymn, is what it is. And you hear this beautiful melody in its simplicity, spun out by the solo cello, and the violas just add a little bit of flavor here and there. I'll have Danny play the beginning of this remarkable symphony. Thank you, Danny. When I first heard this piece, the first thing that I thought about was this just seems like a church meeting to me. It seems like everyone in Oklahoma is sitting in a very small church in the middle of a prairie, and it's a hymn, is what it is. Very original music. It's not based on anything. From there, the rest of a few other strings join in, a few handful of woodwinds. The music becomes very dense. and complex. I apologize, I can't play any more of the symphony for you because we can't fast forward through this. We don't have the separate tracks, so I leave that for you if you haven't experienced the symphony when you hear it tonight. Just a few things to be aware of. In your program book, it actually lays out the 5 sections of the symphony, from the statement of the tunes and the violins, this what he calls tragic section. You come to a very lyrical section, just full of rich romanticism. There's a lot of unison within the string section, which means that all 5 sections of the orchestra, the first violin, seconds, violas, cellos, and basses, are all playing the same line, which is a nice effect, but something that usually isn't done for any extended period of time because it just becomes, again, very dense, very heavy. But that's exactly the sound that Roy Harris wanted. So these beautiful melodies, you really only have 2 or 3 things that are happening in the orchestra at all because 50% of the orchestra is playing one line. From there, you enter one of the most unique sections in all of American music, I think. It's called the pastoral section, and you can't miss it. What happens here is, if you watch the strings, they have really, I think, one of the most difficult violin parts or string parts I've ever come across. And it's only meant to be an effect. What they have are these arpeggiated, very rapid notes that just go by, really, it seems like a mile a minute. But it's, again, an effect. And a conductor told me this about 10, 12 years ago. The effect of it is fields of wheat. As they blow back and forth in the wind, you see this uniformity, and I'm from Indiana, so I can attest to this. It was corn there, but when the wind blows, it blows all the crops in one direction, and this ebb and flow of the shape, it's very beautiful. It's exquisite. And that's the effect that Roy Harris gets with this, because he has the entire string section playing extremely softly, these cascading scales. But he's got the orchestra divided up so that no one's ever playing the same pattern. You have these crisscrossing patterns that go back and forth. And again, it's all very, very soft. It's just for the effect of these fields of wheat blowing in the wind. And on top of that, you have these very fragmented woodwind melodies that just come in and out. They're not related to each other at all. One instrument enters. It's like the flute listens to the English horn and goes, oh, okay, how about this? And then spins off another melody. And it just kind of winds itself up, and you'll notice that the strings start to get louder and louder and louder and louder before everyone in the orchestra is starting to play, and the music is at a frenzied pace here. And it leads into one of the great examples of American cowboy music at this point. It's the fugal section here, what's called the dramatic section. This is cowboy music at its finest. Billy the Kid, Copland's first major ballet score, had been written about a year earlier, but Roy Harris wrote this music, I think, with no knowledge of what Copland had done in Billy the Kid. And he came up with, and when you hear this, you go, that's exactly what it is. It's cowboy music. Bum, bum, ba, 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 bum. Ba, 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 da, and timpani is just banging away, and it's just really a lot of fun. The themes are interwoven on top of each other. That leads up to another frenzy, and then what you have actually at the end of the symphony, what Copland called a conventional ending, was what Harris calls his dramatic, tragic ending here. It goes back to G minor again. The timpani is playing a funeral dirge, and the music comes to just a standard closing of what many symphonies have. It ends on a tonic chord, and it has a final note, and that's it. And for all the originality in this symphony, to end it in such a conventional way was a criticism that had been heard not only in Harris's time, but to this day as well. I think it's a great ending. It works terrifically. And what you end up having is 18 minutes. That seems a little longer than that, but it has just so rich and full of American material, distinctly American voice Roy Harris is. He's got a number of other symphonies that have been recorded on the Naxos label. His 4th symphony is a collection of American folk songs. His later symphonies are a little bit more complicated than the 3rd symphony is, but they're all wonderful music that deserves to be heard, just doesn't find its way on programs very much anymore. 2 years after Roy Harris wrote his 3rd symphony, Aaron Copland wrote his 2nd ballet score, Rodeo, which, again, the synopsis is in your program book. You don't often hear the full ballet score, but there isn't that much more music than what you hear in the 4 movements from the suite. That's the really good music right there that starts with Buckaroo Holiday. Danny, I'll have you play the first track of this one. Thanks, Danny. That's cowboy music. It's life on the farm. What makes it, again, so distinctly American is that you have very wide open harmonies, which means that the spacing between the notes the instruments play are not compact. Copland really opens it up so that there's distance between the notes. It gives it a broader sonority. You also have parallel fifths and parallel fourths in there, which you'll also hear in the Harris. It's frowned upon. It was frowned upon in conventional teaching of composition that you avoid parallel fifths at all costs. Debussy later introduced it, followed by these American composers who were quite fond of it. So you hear a lot of those fifths, but really the thing that's most startling is the syncopated rhythm of it. This really jazzy gesture, this high energy, the accents really make everything about that. The first movement is Buckaroo Holidays, a lot of fun. There are moments in the middle of it where the music becomes a little bit slower. There are moments of great humor in there as well. There's a fantastic trombone solo in there, if you're not familiar with the piece. That is, it just brings a smile to my face every time that I hear it. And of course, our principal trombonist, Jonathan Lombardo, has a great time with it. He's terrific. The two middle movements, which I won't play now, are really offset the high energy of the outer movements, because you have a choral nocturne, which is just the cowboys sitting around under the starlight by the campfire, talking to each other. You know, maybe one of them has a harmonica that he's playing, but it's very docile music, very serene and very calm, beautiful melodies in there. You have the Saturday Night Waltz, where you can imagine that they come together and they dance, and that leads, of course, into the famous last movement, Danny, which is... Thanks, Danny. Which, next to Sleigh Ride, might be the piece I've conducted the most in my entire life. I love it. It's great. You know, you can take it for granted as a musician when you play a certain piece so many times, just how much fun that it really is. We do that piece, of course, on Summer Parks concerts, Pops concerts. It finds its way into our season maybe two or three times. But it really is great music. It's nice to be able to present it in a classic setting, because that's really what Copland intended it for. His three great ballet suites, of the three, the Rodeo four dances are most often considered pop. Because, again, Arthur Fiedler recorded them, the Boston Pops heralded them immediately after the ballet was premiered, and ever since then they've been considered pop music, but they really aren't. It was meant to be a serious ballet, a ballet that was intended to be fun, but a serious ballet nonetheless. And if you ever get the chance to see the ballet done, it's really interesting, because when you think of ballet, you don't think of cowboys and their leather chaps walking across the stage in a very rigid manner, but that's exactly what the choreography for Agnes de Mille, what she had. It really is interesting to see it in its original setting for ballet, but you almost always hear these four pieces now in a concert setting. I'm going to talk about briefly the other piece that opens the program, and that is John Adams' Lollapalooza. Lollapalooza is a term that's been around for a while. I think it's mentioned as a boxing term in your program, but actually, if any of you remember, it was a it still is a music festival, alternative music festival that I think was in the 90s. When I was in high school, it was really popular. I'm not sure how popular it is anymore, but it's a rock and roll piece. This is 6 minutes of rock and roll for orchestra. It's a little loud, but it's the fun kind of loud. John Adams is a minimalist, so what you actually hear are 6 or 7 little motivic fragments that just start to expand, and if you kind of feel yourself headbanging a little bit, that's, I think, what John Adams had in mind. The tune is based on, again, it's on my iPod player, and we don't have that technology here in the hall, so I can't play it for you. But the tune is based on the name Lollapalooza. When you hear the trombones enter about 30 seconds into the piece, they're playing Lollapalooza. Their theme goes, Lollapalooza, Lollapalooza. But actually what they're playing is ba-ba-ba-bum-bum. And it just starts to, you know, it's a rock and roll piece for orchestra. It's really fascinating. It's really extremely difficult, I will tell you that. Everybody on the stage is counting their brains out. My head hurts considerably after I conduct this piece, not because of the volume or anything, but the sheer complexity of the rhythms in this piece. It sounds like everybody is just playing wherever they want. I can assure you that it is extremely involved, extremely complicated. I don't mean to turn any of you off because it really is a lot of fun. John Adams is the most performed American composer who is living now. His music is performed all over the world. Phenomenal artist. But the centerpiece of our program tonight, and I'm delighted to welcome to the stage Mr. Mark O'Connor. It's such a pleasure to have Mark O'Connor here in Western New York. He was just here a few years ago, I believe, playing the fiddle concerto, I believe, with the Orchard Park Symphony, but you were here with the Buffalo Philharmonic a little bit before that, playing your American Four Seasons, I believe. So you're back with us now, and you've got an incredible piece, a brand new piece. But before we get started, I want to talk about the whole idea of improvisation. What is your experience with improvisation, the different kinds of improvisation, and just about the difficulties, but also the creative freedom of improvisation?
Well, let me make sure I'm on. Check. Thank you very much. It is wonderful to be here, and the orchestra sounds just incredible. And so I'm really looking forward to it. And I was back. It's been about 10 or 12 years. I was with the Buffalo Philharmonic, and we did a PBS special together on the American Seasons. That was my 4th concerto, and now this is my 9th concerto that you'll hear tonight. So I've been busy writing over these last 10, 12 years. Probably the most productive, actually, part of my life as a composer. Before I forget, I wanted to say that we're going to I brought 3 different CD titles, and we're going to give a bunch of free CDs away in the lobby after the concert, and I'll be out there to autograph them. If you're interested, I've got my Americana Symphony, also that I composed about 3 years ago, and that's in addition to the 9 concertos. And then I have my double violin concerto album here and my string quartets. So if you're interested, we'll see you after the concert. I'll be after the whole concert. I'll go out there. Improvisation is something that I learned how to do as a part of my musical training because in addition to classical music training, I also had jazz music training and folk music training. And in folk music and jazz music, there's an element of improvisation that is kind of customary with those genres. And so I was learning how to improvise, and I believe I was actually improvising on stage by the time I was 13 years old. And so now, in the jazz musicians are best improvisers, pretty much. And the idea of improvisation is sounds very, very free and independent, but often it is tied to a very strict structure. Usually jazz musicians, including myself, choose a fairly simple song structure to improvise over. That's why when you buy a jazz album, they're usually playing standards, and then they improvise over the standards, because if there's an A part and a B part, and you can kind of keep track of your form, and you can kind of go off and come back, and keep track of the structure. This is a whole different challenge, because, of course, classical music is long-form pieces usually, especially with symphony orchestra. So this is a 5-movement piece, and the structure is huge. And therefore, I brought my score up here with me. You can't see that from here. But I'm going to be actually having some sheet music, but it's not actual notes. So I'm going to have this on a stand, and this, and I'll be flipping a couple of pages here while I'm playing. What I'm doing here is I'm keeping track of the structure. So I've got letters indicating when new parts start, and then also I've got the meters. The meter changes. There's a lot of odd meters in this, so I can keep track of, if I'm in a 5/4 measure at that point or not. And then hundreds of chords. Hundreds of chord symbols are indicated, so I can know what harmony that the orchestra is in that I composed for the orchestra. Now, eventually, I'll probably be able to remember this and memorize it, just like a lot of people, including myself, I've memorized, for instance, my own fiddle concerto. But that was after several performances. This is a pretty new piece. This will be the second time I performed it. So perhaps by the 10th time, I won't need this guide. But nevertheless, I'm still improvising. I'm just, I'll have internalized the structure of the piece and where those odd meters are. Even though I wrote them, it's just, 40 minutes long, so it's hard to remember exactly. And a lot of the tempos are fast, and so this kind of helps me as a guide.
It's fascinating because when I first met with Mark to go through this, Mark, what am I supposed to do? I've never done a concerto before where there's no solo part in the score. I just have chords. So you treat it as a symphony. You conduct the orchestra as if it's a symphony, and you don't even have to look at me. It's amazing that we had these 2 run-throughs now, and it's completely different what he does. You came in, like the first 3 bars of your last movement, the first time, and the second time you're just sitting out and smiling at me, and I'm thinking, this is very unique.
That was an improvised smile, too. Everything is improvised, what I'm going to do. And that brings a good point. For this to be truly improvised, I have to be able to have the ability to just not play and improvise when I play and when I don't play. So therefore, in the composition, it is like a symphony. The themes are carried by the orchestra. So I don't play any of the written themes. So I make up, so if I'm doing passage work or if I'm doing thematic work or accompaniment work or rhythmic work in my improvisation, it's all invented. And then you're going to hear all the themes of the piece played by the different sections of the orchestra. And therefore, if I want to discontinue playing for a number of measures, there needs to be something happening in the orchestra that can carry the piece while I'm improvising the silence.
I'm very curious what your inspiration was for the structure of the piece, the elements, the 4 elements, plus your additional 5th movement.
Well, it's one of those lucky things. I mean, as a matter of fact, the American seasons kind of came up that way. I was talking to someone in a conversation about the American seasons, and I didn't really want to do one pattern completely after Vivaldi and the 4 seasons of the year. And then this conversation reminded me, my cousin actually, I was having a conversation with, reminded me about the seasons of man and Shakespeare's plays As You Like It. And the seasons of a human life really inspired me to create my own American seasons as a musical piece. Once again, I was having a conversation with someone, and we started talking about the quintessential elements and the idea that the 5th element is mysterious. And as soon as I heard something like that, and I referenced that I could, I'm going to give this away probably, but my 5th element in this piece is faith. And so the structure of the elements, starting from fire and air, gradually as the piece evolves, the scorched earth, kind of dust and air and fire feeling of the music turns to humanity once water is inserted in the water movement of the 3rd movement. And once there's an interface to humanity, then the modality of the first movements transgress into more modulation, more harmony, and more rhythms. And then eventually, when we get to the 4th and 5th movement, the stylistic aspects of Americana really come into play. And so the whole piece has a musical journey that I'm able to hopefully build in my improvisation. So I have a starting place and then some place I'm shooting for at the end.
And then you have to come back tomorrow and listen to a completely different solo part than what he's playing tonight. But I trust you. This is really one of the most phenomenal scores that I've come across in its originality. And of course, we have one of America's great performing artists here. And it's just great to have you here in Buffalo with us playing this incredible concerto, Mark. Looking forward to tonight.
Thank you so much. I hope you enjoy it.
Be sure to get your CDs out in the lobby afterwards, ladies and gentlemen.